Good morning, students. This is Arindam Bagh here, and today our topic is Ghosts by Henrik Ibsen. In my earlier presentation, I've given you the summary of Act 1, Part 1 and 2. So, today, as per the heading, as you can see here, we'll be dealing with Part 3, 4, and 5. So, what we have in Act 1, Part 3. So, here what happens, Oswald enters wearing a light overcoat and smoking a pipe. So Pastor Manders is pleasantly shocked at how closely he resembles his famously upstanding father. So there's been a similarity between father and son. So Pastor Manders realized that Mrs. Alving glows with pride at the maturity her son shows in dealing with the pastor's muddled apologies for having formally disapproved of his way of life. Any mother will be very much proud of her son when her son comes to maturity. The same thing happens with Mrs. Alving also. So the pastor describes the way the outlines of Oswald's mouth resemble the late Captain Alving's. So yes, obviously his father is Captain Alving. There should be a facial resemblance will be there. But Mrs. Alving insists that Oswald doesn't favor his father in the least because she knows very well the characteristics of Captain Alving. So it is like a nightmare for her if someone compares Oswald with her husband, Captain Alving, because there are many faults, or rather, Captain Alving, the character of Captain Alving, was not very bright, especially from the point of morality. She asks him not to smoke in the garden room, and Oswald complies, saying that he was only smoking because it was his father's pipe. He had smoked it only once before as a small child, and at his father urging. This is a story actually which is mentioned here, and remembers having been sick. Mrs. Alving insists that this must have been a dream. So the conversation turns to Oswald's life abroad, how he spent his life in Italy. The pastor emphasizes the importance of the ancestral home of living with a family. Now, Oswald enjoyed a life in Italy. When he came back to Norway, he is not very happy. But pastor says that it is very important to live in the ancestral home and especially live with the family. Oswald mentioned that he has lived with families, albeit not families officially married by the church. The pastor is appalled, but Mrs. Alving supports her son. Oswald becomes emotional in his arguments, complaining about the hypocrisy of many Norwegian men who declaim the bohemian lifestyles he loves. So this happens in Act 1. So now we'll be moving to the commentary section. Here when Oswald enters, he is wearing a light overcoat. I told you at the beginning. This contrasts with the pastor's entrance. The pastor was wearing a heavy overcoat and carrying an umbrella, heavily shielding himself from the dark weather. See the appearance of these two characters. Oswald belongs to the newer generation. Pastor belongs to the older generation. Their the apparels they are wearing, they're different. One is wearing light overcoat, another is wearing heavy overcoat and carrying an umbrella. So he was shielding himself from the dark weather. These details are highly symbolic. While Oswald, as well as we will see later in the play, is practically driven crazy by the gloom, both literal and symbolic, of the community and its natural setting. The pastor is well adjusted to it. This is also reflected in Oswald's speech. It is impassioned. He speaks in bursts of adjectives, whereas the pastor's speech is ponderous, highly rhetorical, and full of stock phrases. The pastor lives his life according to a concrete set of ideals, whereas Oswald acts from the heart. So there's been a difference. Then we have this Mrs. Alving reacts oddly to the pastor's belief that Oswald resembles his father. She doesn't like the idea at all. As we will learn by the end of the first act, This is because she is very much dislikes her former husband but idealizes her son and imagines that she has saved him from his father. Yet, despite her internal rejection of her former husband's way, Mrs. Alving is careful to preserve his public reputation. Yes, there is a differences. As a wife, she is very much duty bound, and she always try to save the face of her husband, or she try to save the reputation of her husband. Thus, she rejects as untrue the anecdote her son tells about his father forcing him to smoke. She doesn't want either of the men to know of her late husband's weakness. So, this is between family, and Mrs. Alving trying to cover her husband's action before the community. In Oswald and the pastor argument over marriage, we see further exposition of their differing worldviews. Oswald declares that Norwegians who condemn Italian artists living together unmarried are hypocrites because they themselves are not free from their own forms of corruption. Little does he know that his father was prone to such moral decay. Later in the play, Oswald will complain about the lack of sun in Norway compared to sunny Italy, where he has been living. Clearly, Oswald takes issue more than the lack of natural light in his hometown. He takes issue with the prevailing lack of intellectual and moral enlightenment. So, this is what we have in this was part 3, and we are moving to part 4. So what we have in part 4? So in part 4, Oswald leaves and pastor begins to sermonize to Mrs. Alving. He reminds her of the time that she fled from her husband and refused to return, attempting to take refuge with him instead. She asks the pastor to remember how miserable she was, but he denounces her rebellious spirit and emphasizes that it is not a woman's place to judge the husbands she has chosen. He chastises her for endangering her own reputation by coming to him when she is fled. She actually left her husband's character, her husband's behavior, Captain Alving's behavior. She was very much, annoyed with that, and she tried to left. She actually left. He then compares this earlier failure of hers to her decision to send her son abroad while he was still so young. He shares her with guilt. She responds with measured, deliberate speech. She tells him that, contrary to public belief, her husband did not turn over a new leaf after she returned to him. She reminds the pastor that he never once visited her after she returned to her husband, and they moved to the country to the house she presently lives in. She also says that her husband did not reform, rather, she simply learned to accept his faults. This is the biggest learning actually, to understanding each other's fault, because nobody is perfect in this world, and hide them from the world. When she bore him a son, he only became worse. She spent nights coaxing him to drink himself to sleep so that he would not go carousing. She only survived because of the public works that she is coordinated, the same works that gained Captain Alving his reputation. So let's move to the commentary section, what we got here. So just before the pastor begins to lecture Mrs. Alving, he says that he must speak to her not as her friend but as her priest. Yet this language is full of the same stock phrases as usual. He refers to the wife's duty to her husband just as he referred to the sanctity of marriage to Oswald, or as he spoke to Regina about her duties to Engstrand also as casual. He is always concerned about public opinion. It angers him that Mrs. Alving endangered his reputation by fleeing to him when she was in need. Of course, to his credit, one must remember that Mrs. Alving was attracted to him sexually, and thus her approach toward him could have been seen as improper, and it will start an illicit affair, or rather, parokia, isn't it? The pastor also invoked public opinion when discussing insurance for the orphan asylum. When condemning Mrs. Alving's reading selections and when wondering how to avoid scandal with his speech at the opening of the memorial asylum. Mrs. Alving's speech is watershed. She has apparently never told anyone else about her husband's failing. Like the pastor, she inflates her speech with repetition. The rhetorical pretensions of the educated, her attitude towards the pastor here is complex. First, she is angered that he accused her of betraying a worthy husband and of treating her son just as badly. But she also thinks of him as a friend, or at least as someone for whom she previously had romantic feelings. Also, she is probably concerned to give her speech an air of importance after all. Her mission for more than 10 years has been to maintain her husband's good reputation. Now she is destroying that reputation. At least in the pastor's mind, in a sense, she is making a confession, even though the aim of her speech is to absolve herself of guilt. To understand the rest of the play, it is important to consider how Mrs. Alving must have felt after returning to her husband. The couple moved out of town and she lost contact with the pastor, whom she was fond of then. Despite how she feels about him now, she suppressed her rebellious spirit and put up with a husband who was unfaithful and lazy. Her need to busy herself with project is indicative of her psychological state. She began to think of her husband as an object to be hidden. In the final parts of the act, first act especially, we will see how this pressurized situation led her to deal with her son in the ways she did. So this is the end of part 4. We are moving to part 5. So in the part 5 section we have Mrs. Alving relates to the pastor that she eventually caught her husband trying to seduce their maid Joanna. When he finally got this way with Joanna, Mrs. Alving was horrified and sent the 7-year-old Oswald abroad so that he would not have to witness his father's debaucheries. She continued to maintain the captain's reputation. However, especially in her letters to Oswald, she sent Joanna away with a large sum of money to keep her quiet, to save from scandal actually. The Memorial Orphanage is another attempt to make sure that the truth will never come out. It is also a way of Mrs. Alving to purge herself of her former husband. All of his money is going into the Memorial Orphanage. Her son's inheritance will consist of her money only. The pastor is shocked by Mrs. Alving's divergences and apologizes for his opinions. He concedes that Mrs. Alving has had to endure a great deal. Oswald returns from the work and goes to help Regina prepare dinner. The pastor confesses that it will be difficult to give a speech tomorrow in honor of Captain Alving, but he says that he must do it in order to avoid scandal. Suddenly, Mrs. Alving and the pastor, here Regina, call out from the kitchen, asking Oswald to let her go. They are horrified. Mrs. Alving says that it is ghost as they enter the dining room. She insists that the pastor say nothing. So, this happens here in part 5 actually. Then we have this commentary. It is clear that Regina is the daughter of Captain and Joanna. This extramarital birth was understandably the last straw of Mrs. Alving. She tells the pastor that once she caught them, she immediately took over complete control of all household affairs. Her entire life has been marked by this sort of control over her husband's reputation, keeping her husband home at night, keeping her son ignorant of his father's failings actually, keeping Regina ignorant of the identity of her real father. Mrs. Alving makes two difficult decisions regarding her husband. The first is a decision to maintain his reputation. The second is her decision to completely protect Oswald from his fathers. These strategies are connected. Her son could not remain ignorant of his father's fault if he had a bad public reputation, yet her desire to keep up his reputation is also motivated by a desire to save her own reputation. If the marriage were viewed as a failure, she could potentially be seen as the cause. Indeed, later in the play, she blames herself for not being able to match Captain Alving's joy of life, his verve and spirit. At the very least, she may feel guilty for having temporarily abandoned her husband. Mrs. Alving goes to great lengths to keep Oswald in the dark about his father. She lies to him in his letter and she sends away as soon as he is old enough to ask embarrassing questions. Just as she tries to be perfect wife to her husband, sticking by him and enduring most of his faults, all the while improving his reputation. She tries to give Oswald a perfect pair of parents. The dangers of upholding such a fiction will be revealed later in the play. The close of the first act is almost fantastical in nature. Oswald is flirting with Regina, just as Captain Alving flirted with Joanna. Although Oswald and Regina do not know that they are half siblings, the knowledge of their close relationship causes Mrs. Alving and the pastor to be severely shocked when they overhear Regina's cry that Oswald has tried to touch her. Mrs. Alving attributes Regina's cries to ghosts. Indeed, Regina and Oswald are the child of a man who similarly tried to seduce a maid a generation earlier. Captain Alving's ghost seems to reveal itself through them. Once again, Mrs. Alving feels that she has lost control over the situation, yet she doesn't scream or rush into kitchen. Her first impulse is to tell the pastor not to utter a word to keep up appearances, just as she did the last time such a seduction was taking place. So basically, Mrs. Alving tried to cover up the deeds of her husband and later on of her son. So that will be all for today. Thank you for watching this video. Please like, share and subscribe my channel. Thank you.